When I moved to Harlem, felt like I'd come home. Everything kind of fitted. It felt like a neighborhood, a community. Yeah, I don't see myself leaving.
Harlem has always been seen as a world to itself. Its complex history dates all the way back to the 1600s, thus following periods of immense socioeconomic shifts. One of the most well-known and culturally recognized titles for Harlem is Black Mecca. This nickname began in the 1920s and has prevailed into present day.
It's a Black Mecca because you got to remember Harlem is so close to, it's not only in the heart, of capitalism, but the heart of American fashion and culture, in the heart of its advertising and radio industries. And in that, again, it became a Black Mecca because the sounds, the art, the literature that was being produced there could quickly get out to a broader audience.
From a neighborhood leading in art, music, and the civil rights movement, to becoming a symbol of urban poverty and an overall negligence toward the upkeep of American cities, Harlem is indicative of the rise, fall, and rebirth a community can experience. Today, Harlem's rebirth has been a controversial one, and has even posed the question of where the city will end up. As gentrification rises throughout West Harlem, many wonder if Harlem will be able to maintain its rich culture despite an ever-changing demographic moving in.
The demographics have totally changed. I mean, I like to tell people it's more expensive to live in Harlem than it is in, for example, Scarsdale, Great Neck, any of the suburbs. It's more expensive to buy a property here than it is in what are typically the most affluent suburbs of New York. People who are not that far away, say 20 blocks south, they realize that what they can get further north, and then they start coming up, and then businesses follow, and it's sort of a domino effect. And now you see Whole Foods on the corner being built, and the demographic for Whole Foods, everyone knows what it is, right?
Harlem's history began to take shape in the 1600s after the Dutch began to settle in the city. The Dutch, however, were not the original inhabitants of Manhattan. Native American tribes such as the Lenape and the Canarsie populated the island of Manhattan. As the native population decreased, the Dutch renamed the area New Harlem. The area became a farming community as the 17th and 18th centuries progressed. Dutch, French, and English settlers saw Harlem's transition from a rural area to an upper and middle class vacation destination because it was considered far away from the heart of the city. By the end of the 1800s into the 1900s, immigrants from Italy, Ireland, and Germany, as well as African Americans fleeing the South, moved into Harlem in numbers. Harlem quickly became an epicenter for art, with vaudeville acts and theaters popping up all throughout 125th Street. As the years pressed on, Harlem's resident culture began to shift once more as Italian, Jewish, and German immigrants decreased as the real estate began to crash. As white renters became sparse, black real estate companies found a market selling these abandoned properties to black renters. Examples of this can be seen through West 138th Street's Astro Row houses and the Stryver Row homes on West 138th and 139th Streets during the 1920s. Both Astor Row and Stryver Row featured beautiful architecture mixed with outdoor space that were very unique for homes within the city. These homes, once designed for wealthy white residents, were leased to black tenants. During the early 20th century, the Great Migration brought many blacks to the north following the Civil War. By the 1920s, more than half of Harlem's population was black. This prompted the aforementioned title Black Mecca, as activist groups such as the NAACP and Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association began to make Harlem home. Music, art, and the overall Harlem Renaissance began to take shape. Speakeasies, theaters, and clubs were hotspots for entertainment, with popular musicians like Billie Holiday, Miles Davis, and Duke Ellington performing on Harlem stages, often to audiences of many white individuals who are fans of the blues and jazz sounds.
People from high society who want to dabble in things that in their high society will be poo-pooed upon, right? You can't do that. They will go to these exotic, erotic zones, these black neighborhoods, where in a way it's kind of venturing into some other time and place where they can let out their inhibitions. And in some ways, something like prohibition actually leads to more white intermingling in a place like Harlem.
Art and poetry also flourished during the time, with some of the world's best-known writers like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, and Richard Wright creating their legacy in Harlem.
But on October 29, Black Tuesday, the bottom dropped out. The average price of major stocks falling nearly 40 points, with chaos at the New York Stock Exchange.
The years following the Harlem Renaissance were arguably the most socioeconomically challenging years the community had ever faced. The 1930s Great Depression left many Harlem residents jobless. Race riots began to ensue throughout Harlem, even throughout the 1960s, with the civil rights movement raging. Politicians like Adam Clayton Powell and activists like Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X pushed for equal opportunities and fair treatment for blacks in the midst of racism and police brutality. The real estate and housing markets became a huge issue in major cities, including New York, throughout the 1950s and 60s. Minorities living in Harlem struggled with overpriced housing, while the maintenance of homes decayed. Subsidized housing projects created decades prior were becoming dilapidated. While the high costs of living persisted, many Harlemites were forced to leave and move to other struggling boroughs, such as the Bronx and Brooklyn. Drugs, crime, and unemployment were rampant throughout much of Harlem. Infant mortality rates were some of the highest the city had ever seen. Organized crime based around heroin created an epidemic of dope dealers and drug users.
Contributions. His contributions are usually drugs, which bring to me youngsters of my race, young people. This is what is so frustrating. These are pre-teenagers, 13 to 15. Beautiful specimens, dead from overdose, and we see this too often.
Despite the mass departure of many Harlem residents, some Harlemites remained either by choice or a lack of other alternatives. These residents were determined to make a normal and relatively happy life for them and their families. In July 1970, photographer Jack Garofalo captured the vibrant life that remained in Harlem despite the neighborhood's downfall. His pictures became the cover story for Paris Match magazine in October of that year. In an effort to restore the city, many plans were put in place to bring residents back. Some of these restoration plans were helpful, while many others were unsuccessful. It wasn't until the 1990s that Harlem began to see an upward shift. Beautification efforts were in effect with the installation of things like gardens and sidewalks. New stores and entertainment centers were added, one being the Magic Johnson Theater on Frederick Douglass Boulevard.
I lived in Harlem for about 15 years. Not straight. It was first 10 and then 5. We went from local businesses like the local bodegas to like gourmet delis now. I mean, if anyone walks on 125th Street, New York and Company is there now. Whole Foods is about to open. And all the old businesses, like a record label right on, I think it was 8th Avenue, I would go there and listen to the CDs that just came out. It was like a small record shop gone. Like now it's all, big businesses, big stores. And
today, Harlem's neighborhood has changed dramatically. Property values have increased as new residents continue to flood into the community. This shift in Harlem's population is causing many preservationists and some longtime residents to question if these changes are truly positive for the entire community.
I'm from the UK. Actually grew up in Nottingham, but lived in London for most of my adult life, and then moved here to the US 4 years ago. And that was one of the reasons why I moved to Harlem, that it was more affordable than other parts of Manhattan. But that has changed in that relatively short period of time.
As poverty and unemployment continue to plague some Harlemites, the idea of gentrification seems to add more problems than solutions.
Well, I think because people don't see me, perhaps before they know me, to know that I'm a newcomer as well. So I have heard people complaining about how the neighborhood is changing and the sense of community is changing.
Those against Harlem's gentrification argue that the process displaces longtime residents and shifts the culture that Harlemites have built over decades. Those who support gentrification view it as a benefit to Harlem after years of socioeconomic struggles. Supporters believe that helping the neighborhood develop benefits not just the wealthy, but Harlem as a whole.
Those same middle-class people, there have been many studies that are more and more coming out, you know, were some of the first in the 1980s to try to get the crack off the street and ask for more policing. They were some of the, you know, ones that most wanted places like Starbucks or a Pathmark that came, you know, 125th Street. They wanted these stores because they wanted these amenities. But as you get those stores, the problem is if you go into a Pathmark or you go into a Starbucks, you could be in one anywhere in the world. And as that happens, Harlem loses its sense of, again, self. Like it loses its vernacular feel, which is some of the reason why these people are going there in the first place. So that's kind of an ironic twist.
For the individuals I sat down with, gentrification was difficult to define as intrinsically good or bad.
So it's good and bad. I mean, you know, you often hear cries against gentrification, and it oftentimes comes from middle-class liberal people who may be implicated in it. But at the same time, you won't hear cries against, there might be some nostalgia, like, oh, I wish it was the 70s again, when, you know, we could, you know, drink on the stoop without being harassed and go purchase some pot from any place. But there was also the reality that you could get mugged at any time. And people aren't complaining that, you know, shootings have gone down. People aren't complaining that, again, they're not being harassed as much.
I want to say a little bit of both. The changes have been positive in the sense that, you know, the neighborhood is looking, you know, better now. You know, people have options when they want to go to dine and eat. And however, the negative side to it is the price of real estate. You know, it's expensive now. It's, you know, not affordable for many families.
I feel kind of conflicted about it. One, because where I lived in London has gone through the same process. And to be on the other end of the equation, to be part of the influx that's coming in, and I guess, you know, rents being pushed up as a consequence of it, I kind of, yeah, a little unhappy about, and the effect that has on the community that's been here for a length of time. But then I see the resources and amenities that are coming in on the back of that. So, yeah.
It depends on who you're talking to. I mean, there's a lot of factors. I mean, if you look at who it's benefiting, I mean, it's a complicated question without an easy answer.
In spite of the changes in the neighborhood's trajectory over the years, Harlemites have remained strong-willed. A dedication to the arts and an overall resilient spirit has propelled Harlem forward, even in the midst of calamity.
Harlem that used to be, you know, while it expanded over time, they used to also have large sections that were Italian or Jewish. It wasn't always as black or Latino as we might think. As the 2nd Avenue line goes north up East Harlem, that may begin to change as well. Neighborhoods change. Should it stay black eternally, or the idea of it? Will it become just a museum of black culture, but most of the actual black population is missing? Is that something that should be fought for, you know, to maintain? I'd suggest it should be.
As the years progress, Harlem will continue to be a landmark for endurance and tenacity. Time will tell how Harlem will once again reinvent itself in the midst of an ever-changing landscape.